Good.
So, without John here, I'm now doing the videotape. Being in Westerners a long time like I am, I really appreciate all the changes that have happened, not only in this group, but in history in general. And it has amazed me how the subject matter has been changing. Back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, TV Westerns were really important. There was a lot of different things that were important over the decades. And as history has changed, so has interest of universities. I'd like to see more young people attend Westerners. I'd like to see more people attend Westerners. And so one of the things I wanted to do was, as program chairman, I wanted to have a speaker who would bring current thinking about indigenous peoples and their plight. I'd like to learn about how those people affected the West. And so when I searched for different speakers, I was able, with Jim's help, to find a great speaker, and that's our speaker tonight. I have been amazed myself at how much indigenous peoples have been basically changed by all the things in America. Yet they maintain a great interest in their heritage. And so I wanted to learn more about them, and that is why I've selected this speaker, and very happily so. Now I need to mention that our speaker was going to speak in January, and that was of course during the fire when we had to cancel. A lot has happened since then, and she has very graciously agreed to speak this month. So we have tonight a speaker who was a Autry Fellow back in 2010. She is an historian, an author, a professor. She will present a talk how Western history, how it unfolds today from the perspective of the Overland Trail history. And I know I'm not really giving a normal introduction, but I wanted to present this speaker as a testimony to how Westerners should be thinking about what are the current subjects that we should be learning about. So to present a talk on the Overland Trail and its history and how it affects both the indigenous peoples and the Europeans, I present our speaker tonight, Sarah Kais. Please help me welcome. Thank you, dear. And that speaker.
Okay.
Is that set? Okay.
Yeah, I'll probably hold it.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Okay, we got the lights dimmed and everything. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for having me this evening. I'm really happy to be here. I can't thank Joe especially enough. We've had some wonderful conversations over the months since my visit got a little extended, and it's just been lovely. And I really am so grateful for your fellowship support that allowed me to spend a month at the Autry. It really meant a lot to me as a graduate student to have that type of support, and so I really appreciate all the work you all do to keep Western history alive and thriving. And I'm really excited that I'm able to talk with you tonight about the final product from that research, which is my first book, American Burial Ground, A New History of the Overland Trail. And I know we were just doing Western trivia, and I promise you we're not doing more Western trivia, but I do have a question for you. I was wondering if anyone knows where this picture might have been taken or what's pictured here. This is the front, of course, cover of my book. Any ideas where this might be? Guesses are fine. It's somewhere along the Oregon and California trails, so that's a long ways, right? 2,000 miles, but maybe we have some ideas. Maybe someone's heard about this. Any ideas? I'll give you a hint. I'm from Nevada. This is from my state. Any ideas? So this grave site is out in Lincoln County, kind of outside Elko, so we're in eastern Nevada, right along the trail, more or less off I-80, and we actually got this photograph in wintertime where normally there'd be snow on the ground. But I had a photographer out there in Elko, and we were hoping to get a photograph where there was no snow to capture that summer immigrant experience of that westward wagon journey in the summer and fall. And so she waited till the snow melted, and then she ran out there with her camera, and she got this beautiful picture that shows you all the mineral colors on the hills. Now this grave site is an immigrant grave of a woman named Lucinda Duncan. And for a long, long time, people around this community outside of Beowawe, Nevada, memorialize this grave as a maiden's grave. Has anyone heard of a maiden's grave or seen them anywhere along the West? Yeah, there's a whole collection of them. Sort of this idea of a young woman who sacrificed herself, lost her way in this very arduous 2,000-mile trek to the Pacific coast. And so Lucinda Duncan was known as the maiden of the Maiden's Grave for a long, long time. And then in the mid-20th century, some historians came along and they discovered something else. Lucinda Duncan was a grandmother, not so young, not so much a maiden, right? But the story of the Maiden's Grave was really important. It told a particular story about the westward immigration, about the types of suffering and sacrifices that people went through to make their way. It sort of created this ideal woman who might have lost her life on the trail. And so that's really what my book is about. It's not just about the migration itself, but how people remembered it and how people memorialized it. And you all know how important westward migration and the trails are in popular memory. I don't need to tell you, as sort of Joe gestured to, that wagon trains and wagon trails have been sort of the centerpiece of popular memory of Western history. Anybody recognize this guy here?
John Wayne.
John Wayne, absolutely. This is, I think, 1937's Big Trail, right? So cinematic icons. This is from 1967, another cinematic depiction of the trail. I like this one because we have not only the men in the wagon trains, but the women and children who are a really important part of this westward movement, particularly to Oregon, but also to California as well. It shows how the sort of division of labor worked on the trail. You got the men driving the wagons, riding the horses, women and children walking alongside during the day. And of course, a woman's work was never done on the trail. You've got camp at night and all those other things. Does anyone know what this scene might be from? This is a 21st century depiction of the wagon train. It has not gone anywhere in popular culture. So mid-20th century, we've got it on the big screens, the movies. 21st century, we also have small screen adaptations of the trail. This is actually from a series from Paramount that you can also watch on Amazon. It's called 1883. I don't know if anyone's seen it. Okay, I see some nods in the audience. It's part of Taylor Sheridan's work. And this series focuses on a wagon train that's moving from Texas to Montana. And I love this recreation of the idea of a thunderstorm coming out on the plains. If you're on the 2,000 miles routes to Oregon and California, you're living outside for 5-6 months. All you have to protect you when something like this blows through is those thin topped wagon covers, right? Those canvas covers on top of the wagon. So again, wagon trains still being represented, and even on computer screens. This is a snapshot of the Oregon Trail computer game. This is a new version of the game that came out a couple years ago. It's got really good graphics. First version, not so much. So this was my version, paper towel wagon. There you go, paper towel roll wagon. This is what I remember playing when I was a kid in computer class. And this was how I first learned about the trail. You're trying to make it to Oregon alive. These are sort of my first exposure to what this journey was about. But I think it really speaks to not only the importance of wagons in Western history and memory, but the ways in which these many, many, many different migratory pathways across the continent, we're going through the Southwest, we're going farther north through sort of the central plains, but then also up into Oregon. All of these routes, they're very distinct. You're moving through different places, you're moving at different times, but they're also all connected. The idea of the United States getting to the Pacific coast, getting overland to complete the nation, to fulfill that manifest destiny in the mid-19th century. Now, one of the things we're learning more and more about is how, like my friend Michael Block shows in his work, who's sitting next to me at the table tonight, how Americans are already out in the Pacific doing lots of things, right? But the overland journey has this sort of hold on the national imagination to get across overland, to fulfill that sort of destiny of the nation and sort of that legacy of your ancestors to travel all the ever farther west to the Pacific coast. And so this is what I was really interested in when I was working on this book, these meanings that people gave to this immigration. And I realized that it's a lot about death. The Oregon Trail game itself is trying to get to Oregon alive. Get dysentery, drown in a river, that's another way to go. Have a firearm accident. They weren't so good about making sure their rifles were safe when they put them in the wagons. A shot might come out when you're behind it. That's not a good place to be, right? There's all sorts of challenges that happen. So in the Oregon Trail game, when you play it, the idea is, how do I keep everybody alive so I can make it to Oregon? And if you don't make it to Oregon, you got to start over. Game over, it would tell you, right? I know this well. I lost the game a lot when I was younger. But when I started to get into primary sources about the trail, reading people's diaries, reading people's memoirs, reading newspaper accounts of the trail, I found something else. That it wasn't game over for people who died. Instead, it was the start of something new. It was the start of a placement on the trail that put them in a special place in American popular culture that sort of enshrined them in memory of the trail experience. And we can see this. I don't know if anyone's familiar with J. Goldsboro Bruff. Okay, famous cartographer and draftsman who created some of the most well-known images of the trail experience. We can see this centrality of dying and death in the sources of the time. Here we have the immigrant's burial. It's Bruff's Mail Mining Company caring for the body of Charles Bishop. And I'll read the inset for you. It says, Charles Bishop of Washington City died July 8th, 1849 of cholera, aged 25 years. So cholera is the primary killer on the trail. Washington City refers to Washington, D.C., where Bruff and his company left from. And then 1849, of course, the year of the gold rush, when you get like sort of the biggest surge across the trail. And we can see the care that goes into caring for Bishop's body, the military procession where they're carrying him. And they're not just burying him in camp, they're burying him up on a rise. Why would they do that? So people can find him. So that later wagons, when they're passing through, will see the marker up on the hill and they'll go pay their respects. So this is a really important piece, not only for this company, but for everybody at large who travels across the trail. And this death was not only in these sort of sketches and things like people Bruff created who actually went on the trail, it also becomes part of the representation of the trail for national audiences. So I don't know if you all are familiar with the famous sort of historical painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, that famous painting from about the Revolution. Well, this is the same painter, Emanuel Leutze, who paints westward the course of empire. And it still hangs in the U.S. Capitol building today. And it was commissioned during the Civil War by the Union government. They're redoing the Capitol, and they want to create a testament to Union strength and spirit and sort of national movement. And they want to celebrate that westward expansion. And so Leutze goes out west. He goes as far as South Pass in the Rockies, which this painting is sort of centering immigrants getting across that mountain range. And he goes out and he paints that triumphal story. This is the final image. But I want to show you something else. I want to show you Leutze's mural study. And I want to show you something in it that didn't make it into the final painting, but made it into the second to last draft. Here it is. And here it is even bigger. So what do we have here? What we have here is built in to that triumphal narrative of westward expansion. We also have that centrality of death, dying, and sacrifice on the trail. And here we also have this sort of classic image of a woman mourning on her knees as the men lower the body. We didn't have that female representation in the Bruff image, but we have it here. And so my point is that even as the Union government is focusing on triumph and the positives of westward expansion, whites knew, like immigrants at the time, that this was also a really important piece of this journey. Because the trail is a long trek, and it's often a deadly one. And it's deadly primarily because of disease, but also because of accidents and other things that get people. And so this is a really important piece to remember when we're thinking about the trail. And it's a topic that ultimately became the focus of my book and my research. And the other thing that I found in my research, and this is something that Joe gestured to in his very kind introduction, is I found the ways in which this experience of suffering and dying and death on the trail also connected this experience of immigrant expansion to the experience of native dispossession. Because one of the major events over the course of the 19th century in United States history is that expansion of U.S. land holdings and then that shrinking of native land holdings. This is one way to think about that process. This is a digital map that was created by a historian named Claudio Sant, and it depicts native land holdings in January 1850. So this is about 6 months after Charles Bishop was buried on July 8th, or soon after July 8th, his date of death, 1849. Now, Bishop was buried near Horse Creek, somewhere between Scotts Bluff and Fort Laramie. So he's very kind of in the blue right around here. So this is what we're looking at in January of 1850. And then this is what we have in January of 1893. So this is a huge transformation in a relatively short amount of time. And one of the things I found as I was doing research on my book is the ways in which the discussions of graves as markers of important remains, as claims to land, were discussions that were happening simultaneously from indigenous folks who were talking to white Americans and white Americans who were talking to themselves and also to indigenous folks. So sort of this cross-cultural conversation about pointing to graves as places that were also part of their nations and their kin and their communities. And this came out really strongly in Histories of the Overland Trail because it's such a long route, there's so much death, particularly from cholera on it, and it stretches so many thousands of miles. So one quote actually that really stuck with me when I was thinking about the importance of graves to claiming land is actually a quote that comes from a very different context, a very different place. It's about sort of mid-20th century European politics, and the Serbian nationalist is asked, hey, when you think of Serbia's borders, like where should they be? And he says, well, Serbia is wherever there's a Serbian grave. So there's a similar logic in a different context that really helps to define the significance of graves along the immigrant trail in the mid-19th century, and also for how Native peoples and Native nations talk about their claims to the land and homelands in this same time period. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this claim, but I'm really going to do so by talking about my research process, because sort of this culminating connection that I made was in no way where I started with the book. I started with the book in a very different place. I was really just thinking about, how am I going to approach the Overland Trail in new ways? And so I'm going to talk about sort of my research process, how I came to choose the trail as a topic, and then how I went through the source material to begin to place death at the center, and then how I made the connection between immigrant history and Native history. So, talked with you about the Oregon Trail game. I showed you that horrible, pixelated, paper towel roll wagon. But my real journey on the trail, my real understanding of its history started here. Does anyone know where Fort Casper is?
Wyoming.
Yeah, it's in Wyoming. So it started here in Wyoming. That's me. I'm in the blue polo in the shadow of that 1936 recreation of a Civil War era fort. So I was super lucky. A summer or two after I graduated from college, I got a paid internship at Fort Casper in Wyoming, and I spent the entire days, every day that summer, outside at the fort. I was either sitting by a bench of replica items we had of military uniforms and prairie dresses, or I was leading tours. And I have to tell you, being outside all day on the plains in Wyoming, well, that's a great way to start to understand the immigrant experience. Whoa. It was windy all the time, dust blowing everywhere. Okay, so that's how it was. But the other thing I noticed was that this Civil War era fort was also really important river crossing for the immigration. And so when visitors were coming through and talking to me, I was getting a really good sense of how, what an important role this migration played, not only in the past, but also in people's memories of the West. So I was really interested in that. And then at the same time that I was working there at the fort, I was reading a lot of Western history books because I was getting ready to go to grad school and trying to be a good student. And I was realizing that for decades, Western historians hadn't written about the trail. So I was like, I'm seeing a disconnect here. I'm seeing a disconnect between what the public is interested in and saying and what academic historians have written about. So I was starting to think about, why that was and what I might be able to do about it. The visitors to the fort weren't super interested in that, but they were interested in meeting me because my name, Sarah Kais, is the same name as the first member of the Donner Party who died. So we all wish some claim to fame, and for me, at least in Trails World, this was mine, so there you go. I rolled with it. A few signatures were given, a few photos were taken. So I began to think about why the Overland Trail, what could I do with it? And then I got into the sources. I got into the sources at the Autry, thanks to your generous funding. I got into sources at the Newberry Library in Chicago, which has a fantastic Western history collection. I looked at individual diaries, like this is John C. Anderson's, it's a scan. This is actually a revision of his diary, that's at Utah State. I also found materials in Eastern archives, like the American Antiquarian Society, which is in Worcester, Massachusetts. This is a snapshot of a letter that's part of a much larger familial collection. A member of this Massachusetts family went overland to the gold fields in, I think it was 1849. And then I also even went to the National Archives because I was super curious to see these national connections between the migration and what was happening. And so what I did was I went to the National Archives with a few names, particularly of guys who I knew had been on the trail but also served in the Civil War. And I looked at the pension claims of their widows to see if I could see anything there. And this is a snapshot of a microfilm card that gives me the paging information for Edward J. Bartholomew's file. And I found an Overland narrative in there because he was part of the Jayhawker party that got lost in the Mojave Desert. And as part of his pension claim, his co-traveler, John B. Colton, who played a big role in memorializing the Jayhawkers, wrote about that suffering and sacrifice. So these sources are everywhere, and they're so rich and they tell us so much. And so I knew that I could do something new with them. And I also knew that I was so indebted to people who'd spent so many years going through these materials and working with them. And one of the folks I'm indebted to is Dale L. Morgan, who worked at the Bancroft Library for many, many years. And I think Morgan probably has the best description of these sources. He called these diaries, these memoirs, these letters from the Overland Trails, he described them as a, quote, mosaic in words. The individual words of ordinary people put together, showing us something new about American history and the American experience. And then as I let these sources take the lead, I began to see death at the center of the experience. There was this young man, Silas Newcomb, who I read about at the Huntington Library. And the last thing he does before he leaves Wisconsin for the California goldfields, the last thing he does is he goes to visit and say goodbye to the grave of his mother. There was John Hoover's family. His brother Vincent wrote about how his younger brother died on the trail and the days they spent figuring out where and how they were going to place his brother's body. And they ultimately decided they were going to keep him close to the Platte River, because if they did that, he'd be less alone. He could hear the sounds of the water from his final resting place. There was also Abigail Scott Duniway. Her mother died of cholera when they traveled the trail in 1852, and Abigail Scott Duniway was tasked with writing the journal for her company that was led by her father. She was a teen at the time. And she describes how, like Bruff's company with Charles Bishop, they buried her mother on a rise so that people could see her in the most beautiful spot they could find. And then I also realized that this work of memorializing the immigrant dead, preserving their remains, is ongoing today. This photo comes from 2015. It's from the Oregon-California Trails Association, and it's up a plaque that marks the spot where Abigail Scott Dunaway's mother was reburied by that association in 2015 to protect her remains. So there's a strong connection between past and present here as well. And then as I zoomed out from the trail to the broader context of the 19th century United States, the 1800s, I'm like, well, of course they're talking about death all the time. This is before antibiotics. This is before they knew they should wash their hands so they don't give each other cholera. And I realized that just really sat at the center of people's experiences, that they can't control when death is going to come because of these limitations of medicine and other things. And one example of sort of this omnipresence of the threat of death that comes from this time period is from John W. Minto. Now, Minto was a really lucky guy. He lived till he was like 92, which is really unheard of for someone who was born in the 1820s, the 1830s. Those people in those decades, when they were born, they had some of the lowest life expectancies of the entire 19th century. So Minto sort of was out of the norm. He defied expectations. But he also talked about death in a way that was super common for 19th century Americans. It really captures how omnipresent it was. And so Minto, when he's interviewed by an early Oregon historian in the early 20th century, sort of asking him about his trip to Oregon. And Minto was especially important because he traveled in 1844, so that's one of the first wagon trains going to Oregon. And so he tells this Oregon historian, Lyman, H.S. Lyman, early 20th century, he's telling him about how he decided to go to Oregon. He says, well, you know what happened is, I was a young man, I was a teenager, and I decided I was going to go. So my family's having Christmas dinner. We finish our good meal, and then I announced to my mother and everybody else, if I live, I'm going to Oregon in the spring. How do you think that went over Christmas dinner? Not so good. But Minto did live. But the key phrase that he uses is, if I live. This is a phrase that was so common. Sign letters off, if I live, I may see you again. Everyone prefaced future plans with it. And that just gives you a sense of how infused in the culture it was, this threat of death. So Minto's a really good example of that. And you can find examples all over 19th century America. I don't know if anyone's ever seen sort of this embroidery work that was really common across the early 19th century. Women and girls were trained to do it. It's very intricate, very beautiful, very time-consuming. This particular image shows that. It's kind of hard to see unless you see those objects in person. But it also is an example of mourning art, which was becoming increasingly popular in this time period. And mourning art that was designed to help to remember and memorialize the dead. And in particular, the location of their graves. Because in 19th century white Protestant culture, which is sort of the dominant cultural group who traveled across the trails, graves are really the most important sites. It's why you want to mark them up on the rises so people on the trails can see them. It's why you want to be able to visit your loved ones, like Silas Newcomb went before he left Wisconsin, because this is seen as sort of the portal to your loved one until you can meet them again in heaven. And so we see that represented here in this mourning picture. And then we also see in popular culture the fear of what would happen to graves that aren't in protected cemeteries like they would be in the East. And so Breath showed us that care that went into burying Charles Bishop's body, but you also have this concern along the trail of what would happen to what was left behind, of the animals that would come and dig in, of the destruction of the tombstone, the fact that any body left behind was very vulnerable and might be lost forever. And so the tragedy of the trail is not simply that you die there, but that your grave could not be protected, that you would lose that physical sanctity, but then also your connection to the loved one. So this is sort of like the great fear and loss of these dead along the trail. And this is something that, this fear and this loss is something that was not only part of immigrant culture and experience, but also of Native culture and experience. So I got really deep into the trail sources. I found all these things they were saying about this fear of leaving their dead behind. And then I realized that this was a conversation that had already been going on amongst Native peoples. who were writing to each other and also talking to white Americans over the course of the 19th century. And so I found this letter. It's by a Cherokee woman named Eliza Jane Ross. She's writing to her uncle John Ross, who served as the principal chief, essentially the president of the Cherokee Nation. And she's telling him she's talking about the horrors of their forced removal, which had happened a few years earlier by the time she's writing in 1842. And she's talking about one of her central fears and sort of the tragedies of that removal as being seeing the graves of their own people strewn many hundreds of miles along the roads and banks of the river. So this is the same type of fear and concern that I saw on the immigrant trails. So I'm like, okay, there's sort of a parallel, interesting conversation going on here. And then I started to look farther into the connections between these descriptions of graves on the forced removal routes, and also what was being talked about sort of in these national conversations. Like we had the Loitza image showing the triumph of Western migration, but then also the tragedy of dying along the trail. And then I also came across this quote by Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson is the principal sort of proponent of the Removal Act, which enables the government to remove indigenous people like the Cherokee from their lands. And I found in this speech that Jackson makes to Congress in 1830 that he too is talking about native graves. And he's comparing the sort of the pain that the Cherokee and others are describing from leaving their homelands as leaving the graves of their fathers. He's comparing it to the experience of voluntary westward migration. And then I'm thinking, so it's not only about graves that are left behind on the removal routes, but also graves that are left behind in Native nations. And this is a conversation that's must be very widespread, because when Jackson speaks to Congress about how removal is going, he makes sure to mention this idea of the graves of their fathers as defining the homelands of indigenous peoples. And so then I started looking through more source material. Like, what was I going to find here, and how was this going to connect to my immigrant story? And I found that for decades, one of the centerpieces of indigenous conversations and sort of pushes to prevent removal from places like the Southeast was to tell white Americans about their connections to their homelands and to describe it in terms of the graves of their ancestors. So this comes from the 1820s in Illinois. This land contains the bones of their ancestors we do not want to leave. This is John Ross himself, the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation in 1836, writing to white representatives, "Our brothers, is it true you will drive us from the tombs of our fathers and of our mothers?" This quote here was published in William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. So this is one of the most prominent abolitionist newspapers pushing for emancipation that exists in the United States. And it's saying that African Americans are as against removal out of the United States as the Cherokee are against removing from the graves of their fathers. So everyone is familiar with this language. And then this final instance comes from a Creek man. So in some instances, indigenous people were able to evade removal, but he's found hiding in a forest, and he asks the people who find him, "Please do not reveal my hiding place, because I want to stay here with the bones of his ancestors." So this is his claim and connection to his land. So it's everywhere, just like it was happening in conversations around the immigrant experience. And then we see not only in the attempts to prevent removal, but also sort of on the eve of forced removal, the ways in which indigenous people focus on their graves. So you have speeches that are given even as they're being removed west, where they're still saying, "Here is the land of our progenitors, here are their bones." You have others who call out the removal, likening the people who are coming in to take their land to stealing the bodies of their ancestors who have been inside that soil. Other Native peoples made sure to mark their graves before they left, either by erecting monuments or sort of little small memorials or other markers, and in this way visibly saying, "We are still here, this is still our land." And they also work to preserve that memory and those connections to their dead, just as immigrants did by, for example, putting the bodies on top of hills so people could see them or find them later. For example, the Miami when they were forced west, they took clods of dirt and small stones from their graves before they left so that they could carry those mementos with them. So in all of these ways, they're working to maintain those connections to their homelands. And then when they're forced west, there are also deaths along the way. And again, just like with the immigrant trails, disease and especially cholera makes the journey really trying and challenging. And it leads to those graves along the way, like Eliza Jane Ross talked about in the Cherokee removal routes. And so I think that in placing death at the center, it does really two things for the trail. I think the first thing that it does, it really connects us to sort of this broader 19th century context of how important and central death was to the experience of living in a way that we don't think about it in the 21st century. This doesn't mean that we don't have tragedies or challenges or death of our own, but it's not as omnipresent as it was in the mid-19th century. And then the second thing that I think it does is that it gets us to a better understanding of the relationship between the voluntary westward immigration across the trails and the forced removals to the west. Now, the distinguished Western historian Elliot West has called these twin migrations, that the ones of dispossession enabled the ones of expansion. But I think there's a deeper connection here as well that shows us not simply the push west in one way and then the push west in the second way, but a way in which they were interconnected into a shared cultural conversation, both to support U.S. expansion and to try to stop it. And so I want to just close with that sort of iconic story of the Donner Party, which for a long time was sort of pointed to as sort of one of the outlying tragedies of the immigration and the trail. The fact that you would get trapped in the mountains, have to cannibalize your own dead. Don't worry, Sarah Kais was not part of that. She died much earlier in Alcove Springs, Kansas, so I was never accused of that by my trail visitors. She's fine out there. But I think that placemaking of the Donner Party as a spot of death is just one example of the many places along the trail that are connected to those sufferings and sacrifices. So not only of the Donners, but of people like Ann Scott, Abigail Scott Dunaway's mother, like Charles Bishop of Bruff's Company, and the many thousands of others of immigrants who died along the way. Thank you for your time this evening.
You can take questions, Sarah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, please.
Definitely, any questions you have. Yes.
Is there a guess or consensus of what percentage loss there was for people migrating west?
Yeah, that's such a good question.
Either just on the Overland Oregon Trail or
Sure.
total, either one.
Sure. Yeah, so numbers are pretty squishy, but we could estimate, like as little as maybe 6,600. But they have this really big role in the memory of the migration and the idea that they could be anywhere along the way. So like with that second sketch from Bruff, we have the fear that the graves could be destroyed. And this vulnerability of the grave makes it possible that they could be anywhere along the west, that sort of any place along the west might be this important place of sacrifice for the immigrant dead. Yeah, so that's a really good question. Yeah?
The fact that there are probably graves out there
Absolutely.
and they're not marked, unknown,
Mm-hmm.
is there any effort to, in the event of their being discovered,
Mm-hmm.
protecting them or something?
Mm-hmm.
I can remember Grapes of Wrath. There's the chapter there where the grandpa dies, and this is in 1930s, and he is interred along the highway,
Mm-hmm.
and they put a bottle or something on his body and say, this is his name, and this is, he wasn't murdered or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But what exists today and what do we do today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good example of the type of sort of basically ad hoc ways people had to approach these burials in an attempt to mark and remember the dead. So along the immigrant trail, you mentioned the bottle. Along the immigrant trail, if they don't have wood for a headboard, they might use a wagon tire. Or if they don't have coffins, they might sort of go from family to family, to wagon, their wagon trains. Hey, do you have a little bit of spare wood? Do you have a little bit of spare wood? People might have portions of Cracker Barrel they might put together to try to protect the body before they buried it. So they're going to great lengths, but also sort of they're not able to meet their cultural requirements and practices. And I think that part of that failure and vulnerability, because when you're migrating, you can only do so much, is part of what continues to drive people today to try to find and mark and memorialize these graves, sort of fulfill these hopes and dreams of the earlier immigrants that they were not able to meet in the mid-19th century. And so there is a lot of work that's still being done today. One of the most active organizations is the Oregon-California Trails Association that we saw on the earlier slide with the 2015 reburial and remarking of Abigail's mother. And they will also go out with things like cadaver dogs to search for remains and things like that to try to mark and memorialize as many as they can. Yeah, it's a great
I can
question.
give you a bizarre example of that.
Okay.
We have a neighbor up in Kern, we own property up there, and he has a big chunk of land. He's working his property, comes across human remains, bones.
Yeah.
They've been there for a while. Well, he calls the Kern County Sheriffs. The sheriffs come out, because you have a body. Turns out to be, I think, 2 or 3 bodies. They take a look, and say, okay, the coroner's gonna come out. Coroner looks as they're old. How old, nobody knows, but they've been there for a while. There's no markings. Then Bakersfield College sends a team out doing an archaeological dig. So they do the whole thing, lay it all out, shoot the lines, plot it accurately, start examining, and it's believed there are some form of Native American. I think they might have been people who died from the march from the Owens Valley down to the Dahomey Reservation, because they went through that area.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't marked. There were people who lived there in our cemeteries. They weren't local people. So you still come across it out in the middle of nowhere. Some guy finds it. And the bones, they're quite stained from age. So they come out and they look. Who knows what, in the long term, that becomes a problem, because you do have that human remains. And if they're indigenous, that can be a real fiasco. So, I mean, it's weird when it happens, but it happens.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. Yeah, Brian.
I'm gonna respond to the last 2 questions. I'm an archaeologist, this is what we do.
Yeah.
It's what we do. And we go everywhere and we find burials all the time. And very few of them are marked.